So David Firestein is one of those original East-West colleagues of mine who in the very early days was John Morose's trusted partner to understand China and all things related to it. I don't know of a serious business person anywhere in this country for sure who doesn't believe that the most important relationship we actually have is with China. They are clearly of a different ideology, but they are not going anywhere. They've been here for 7,000 years. So it's a great privilege to have David, who now for the HGW Bush Center is the inaugural and very influential CEO and president of the China Bush Relations Group. The U.S.-China Relationship Group. Dave Walsh, a dear friend, a board member of our foundation, former Navy SEAL, Intel officer who has created a very interesting series of entrepreneurial businesses in and around bridging the procurement of the national security world to entrepreneurs and others really creating great products, but nobody really knows how to sell or communicate with the government. And Dave's figured out how to bridge that, built the most successful Inc. 500 company, the fastest growing military organization out there, and is now on a new venture called FON Advisors, where I don't do it justice, but it's something about bringing the warrior and the technologist together.
That's the premise. Boom,
there you go. Oh, where's Peter? I did a boom. I counted his booms earlier, by the way. 82. He's like John Madden. I'll let David appropriately introduce Stan Kowalczyk as he just came on board in a really critical role for David, and again, thrilled that he's here. And Jeremiah Baker, one of our Stanford colleagues, not of Stanford University, but like Bill and myself, involved in the very beginning of this operation, and a really interesting entrepreneurial background of his own. And I'm sure he'll take a couple of minutes, hopefully, to tell you his very interesting story. But as we work from the big picture of China down to the realities of cyber risk, down to what are the prophylactics that can be put in place, because all of us have vulnerabilities we don't even imagine. And so Jeremiah has a passion for helping in that regard. And unfortunately, we know of many families that he's had to help. And so he is here with great credential. So with that, David, take it away.
Great. Bob, thank you so much for the kind introduction and the opportunity and privilege of being here with this incredibly distinguished group. I'm David Firestein with the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, and it really is an honor to be with all of you. What Bob doesn't know is I'm the guy who cut the sound off earlier so that I wouldn't be the first speaker after lunch, and that worked pretty well. I know we have very limited time, so let me just go right into some of the points that I wanted to make. Bob asked me to speak at a high level about China, but also to relate it, to touch perhaps very briefly on cyber, which will be addressed much more authoritatively by all of my colleagues here, but also to talk about democratic stability and democratic sustainability, I would say. So let me jump right in. First point that I want to share with respect to China, from a US perspective, I think we have to understand two things are true about China at the same time. Number one, China is the most formidable national competitor that we will have in the lifetimes of every living person today, period. That is absolutely true. It is also true that China is an indispensable partner of our nation, whether we like it or not, and virtually no global challenge of any consequence can be effectively or enduringly resolved in the absence of US-China collaboration. That's also true. And what I think we haven't done a great job of doing in this country in recent years is holding both of those seemingly contradictory but actually not contradictory truths in our mind at the same time. And we have to calibrate our approach to China and our policy toward China on the basis of a recognition of the truth of both of those statements. The second point that I would make is that the sad truth is that the differences, which are considerable and stark, between the United States and China on a whole range of policy issues that are certainly important to the United States, those differences are irreconcilable. We will never, ever agree, the two nations, on matters of human rights, Taiwan, the South China Sea claims, the role of the state in the economy or trade, and the list goes on. The truth is, there will never be a moment when a president of the United States and a president of China come out of a summit and say, hey, we now agree on these things. And so we have to recognize that we are going to be in a permanent state of divergence of views around these very fundamental issues. And what does that mean for our relationship and how we approach China and think about China? Let me note parenthetically, so that I can at least use the word cyber one time in my presentation, that one of the things we don't agree on is what constitutes a legitimate target of espionage between governments. So we have our definition of what's okay to steal and what's not okay to steal. China has its definition, and the two definitions are not the same. China doesn't accept our definition. And whether we like it or not, we have to live with that. And these gentlemen know that far better than I do. The third point I want to make is that, again, recognizing that China is a country we're not going to change, and it is a formidable competitor, how do we optimize our efforts to compete with China and hopefully to outcompete China and defeat China in free, fair, and peaceful, non-military, commercial, and technological competition? And I think we have to go back to some first principles that we have seemingly, in my judgment, lost along the way. Number one, the very simple idea that the only thing we can actually control is us. We can't control China. We can't make them do what we want them to do. If we could, these problems would have been solved a time ago. They can't. And we have to recognize that the one thing we can control is us. We've spent far too much time in this country, in my judgment, focusing on trying to drag them down rather than focusing on what we should be focused on, which is how to enhance our own national competitive capability and to compete stronger and to get better results for our nation. I use the metaphor, it's a track meet. We're in the 100-yard dash and we're in lane 1 and China's in lane 2, and we're sitting there in the blocks thinking, how do we slow them down? It's a losing strategy. We need to be focused on how we run faster, how we train harder, and get a better result. But here are a couple of other basic principles that I think we're starting to lose in this country, in some cases on the basis of a false narrative that is taking hold in our electorate. Number one, and these may sound like controversial statements at this point. Number one, trade is good. Number two, the more trade, the better. Number three, comparative advantage actually works and makes the pie bigger and generates efficiencies. And here's one, probably the most controversial statement that I'll make and that I've made in recent years. Globalization works. It works really, really well. It makes the pie bigger. It generates efficiencies. It makes prices lower. And it creates more wealth for the world. The point of failure with globalization is not globalization. It's in the domestic policy response in this nation to the challenges generated by globalization, because evidently a good swath of the people of our nation didn't feel they got a fair shake. But that wasn't the fault of globalization, that was the fault of poor policy. And we can fix that. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say globalization is horrible. It's not, it works. And if we move away from that, we're going to see consequences that none of us want to see in this country. So let me say one last thing, and that's on the topic of democratic stability and what I would call democratic sustainability. Very much consistent with the ethos of the very fine remarks that Stephen Hines made and that go to the issue of our common purpose and so on. People often ask me, David, do you see China as the number one threat or challenge to the United States? And I say that I think China is the most formidable national competitor that we'll ever face. But it is not the number one threat to the United States or an existential threat or challenge anywhere near that level. What I see as the two big challenges are, number one, our political and public policy discourse in this nation have become unmoored, unhinged from factual reality, and untethered from the real world. And that is seeping into every decision that's made, every debate that we have in Congress and so on. We have 70% of Republicans in this country who state that they don't think Joe Biden was legitimately elected president. We have 43% of the American people, according to Pew and Gallup, that say they're not sure if Sandy Hook or Parkland actually happened. We have 34% of our country, according to American pollsters, that say that they believe in some or all of QAnon. We're living in la-la land. We've lost our mind. That's a good swath of our nation that believes these things. The Chinese don't believe this garbage. I've never met a single Chinese person that doesn't think Joe Biden was legitimately elected president, and the list goes on, or that the earth is round, or that we've sent a man to the moon and brought that individual safely back to earth. We're competing with competitors who are operating in the real world, and if we don't get into the real world, we are not going to win that competition. Yeah. So we've got to fix that problem. That's one. And the last thing I'll say is this. The even bigger problem is that I think the American people in significant numbers are starting to lose faith in the ability of our constitutional processes to deliver results that are fair and that represent the will of the American people. And we started to see that in particular crystallize with the Dobbs decision that the Supreme Court handed down on the issue of Roe versus Wade, overturning that. And we now have a decision that the overwhelming majority of the people of this country are against, generated through constitutional processes. And it brought home to many Americans the fact that our Constitution is not a particularly democratic document in certain really important respects. For one thing, we don't directly elect the President of the United States. As was noted earlier by Peter, Democrats have won 7 out of 8 of the last presidential elections in terms of the popular vote, but have only encumbered 5 of those 8 presidential terms. And that cascades into Supreme Court justices, and the list goes on. Last data point I'll share before I conclude is this. The United States Senate is another constitutional feature that is very undemocratic because of the extraordinary disproportional weight that it gives to states that have relatively small populations, such that in a few years' time, 32 senators will be representing 70% of our population, and 68 senators will be representing 30% of our population. The fact that the Constitution allows for that possibility is a problem. And so what we're seeing is a deterioration and an erosion of the confidence of the American people in our constitutional processes and outcomes. And I think that is the most profound threat that we face in this country today. And the last thing I'll say is this. When the history of this period is written, China and Russia are going to end up having been footnotes compared to these issues. And if we don't get these issues right, the consequences of that are going to be unpleasant and very far-reaching. I hope all of us, in the spirit of the remarks made earlier, in the spirit of the remarks made by my good friend Bob Bernstein, all of us will work together to prevent that from happening. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you guys. I'm an optimist. Let me start with that. Because it's going to go dark. So my name is David Walsh. I'm a former human intelligence officer. Not a SEAL, but my combat deployments were assigned to our premier SEAL unit. My passion is to foster collaboration between the technologist and the warfighter, really just so that the Americans that on a daily basis continue to put themselves in harm's way have every opportunity to get back safely to their families. Right? I think that if you get that for us the end user is the warfighter, and if you can foster that collaboration, you get out to the field sooner with more relevant technology and so on. 23 years ago, I was in a long line in Annapolis, Maryland. Freshly shaved head, the newest property of the U.S. government, member of the U.S. Naval Academy class of 2003. It was a post-Bretton Woods, post-Cold War era of unchallenged American superiority. We were engaged in constructive bilateral diplomacy, with you guys and the generations that had come before us. Our politicians had the good sense still to at least promote the veneer of fairness by maintaining discipline and decorum in both their congressional and diplomatic proceedings. The U.S. Navy safeguarded the sanctity of U.S. trade, so everybody in that line was very proud of their country, irrespective of our demographics, political provenance, massively excited and eager to be of service to our shared American ideals that we outline in our common purpose. Quick aside, as dint of the alphabet, Sherman Williams, who's going to speak here on Monday, was 4 or 5 positions behind me in that line. Right? And so hilarious to all of us that we would be here all these years later speaking at Stanford. But this is where it's going to take a hard turn as a trigger warning. Between us, we have 24 friends who met their violent deaths in defense of our shared American ideals. They wouldn't recognize the country we're in today. They laid their lives down in support of ideals that we don't even pretend to espouse anymore. Right? We've abandoned all discipline and decorum in favor of like clickbait and snark. Both our domestic and international politics. Again, we tell the partisan hacks on either side, unless you're going to round up the other half of the country and put them in camps, like you need to find a way to come together. Right? You can't do this internally, domestically, without the other half of the country, and globally, you can't do it with the other, 4 or 5 billion people on the other side of the globe. That hasn't happened in a generation. We've abandoned that entirely. The state of geopolitics is critically adversarial. And just we need to find a way to come together. If we can't get along with each other, we can't defend ourselves. We can't lead in the world. And as much as I'd like to provide some relief from having sucked the energy out of the room, what I will offer is empirical support for my alarm. So Stan Kowalczyk, colleague of mine, started his career in a series of startups that ultimately ended in acquisitions. He did some of the earliest networking, OS, and cloud strategies out there. Was then recruited back into some very specialized functions inside the Department of Defense. In the last 4 years was a chief technology officer at a special mission unit involved in, let's say, both current and future cyber operations. So let Stan reinforce my alarm here.
Well, thank you for having me here. So I'm going to switch and transition over into a little more cyber focus on this piece. But I do want to kind of just give a little bit of history on cyber. Very early on, cyber started as soon as we built the first software or hardware device. People were curious, and if you take a look at most hackers or cyber, the two things that really drive them are curiosity and ego, two very powerful forces. At that stage, it was really just individuals that were trying to understand how systems are working and then making them do things that are different. Fast forward a little bit, we start going into the internet cafe era. This is where a lot of the computers were going into a single physical location and the people were going there. So of course, cyber followed. And we're starting to see more criminal activity in criminal organizations because they're starting to realize how can we start capitalizing on that. Move forward a little bit, computers become cheaper. Now they're at the homes, businesses, and of course cyber follows. So cyber goes onto the computers, onto the mobile phones, and we start getting more and more information. And lastly, we come to today. So today, cyber has matured and professionalized. It's become a national lever of power, along with diplomacy, military, economic. And what that means is when the president responds to a particular action, the first question is, where are the aircraft carriers? But the silent question is, what are the cyber options that we have available? And this was very evident to me when Iran attacked us, and the COCOM commander, the first question that he came out within minutes was, what are the options that we have available, and how can we respond? And we're building packages immediately so that they have options on the table that the president can approve. And that's possible because cyber is considered part of the multi-domain fight that we have that's going on right now. So everyone is familiar with air, land, and sea, but we've now included cyber and space and a couple others, and we're melding all of those domains together because each one has a weakness, but then we use that strength from another domain to weave between those to create our packages and moving forward. Now, just on cyber itself, it's become multimodal. If I take a look at how a lot of the previous cyber operations were, they focused on computers, phones, a lot of things that you would think of. However, today, it truly is multimodal. So we're looking at cars. That Tesla you have, great target. IoT devices, everything you're putting out there helps me get a lot of information about you. The radio frequencies that you're putting out, collect a lot of that there. Hardware, supply chain. Supply chain's an interesting one because the entire supply chain, we can go ahead and insert key things that we want in there. If I take a look at the development chain, I'll go to a certain company that I know you're using their software, hardware, what have you, and I'll implant something in there so I don't have to get into your company directly. I got in indirectly and it's going to come out. If I take a look at the AI that's going on here, one of the other things that we use AI on the offensive as well, But we're also looking at the counter AI. You have AI that does things, well, we know what you're doing. We know your models. So we figure out how to actually go ahead and convince your AI that we're not there. And the other piece that I do want to kind of point out is like, who are the actors besides the nation state? So that's the main focus we've been on, but we're also dealing with pseudo OGAs, or other governmental agencies and non-governmental agencies. These are essentially proxy groups that nation states are using to conduct their operations so they can go into gray legal zones. Of course, the criminal organizations are still there, and activists and individuals are all playing at this field. Now, everybody is following a very similar operational model. And one of the first things is identifying what the target is, whether that's information, an asset, a person. We identify that piece first. Then we go into reconnaissance mode. Everyone here has a signature. And so what I do, and these organizations, we look at what your signature is. What information are you putting out there? What do you like, what you don't like? Who you people you associate with? Build a network map of humans, ideas, companies. And then once we have an understanding of what that looks like, then we can determine what the best opportune path to get in to get our target. And so then we start going through reconnaissance and validating all that information, identifying where the vulnerabilities are. Once we identify the vulnerabilities, and similar to the multimodal, we'll actually go bounce around to different areas. You know, that Tesla might be one of the access paths that we get into because it's going somewhere. And then we rinse and repeat until we finally get to our target, get the information that we want, and then depending on the type of operational that we're conducting, we may do a cleanup. And I say that because there's generally 3 different types of operations types that we go through. The first one is intelligence gathering. So we would go into an organization, or these actors would go into an organization, and put ourselves in there just to collect information, not to influence you or affect you, but collect that information for another operation that we have out there. Because again, when we take a look at the multimodal, it might be impacting a kinetic operation outside. The other one is influence operations. I may not want you to, or I may not want to do something specifically, but I may want you to change your position, change your mind, change a decision, or a client of yours, I may want them to change it. So I might go in and change or tweak some data to influence you. And then the last one, which is the one that I think most people are familiar with, is effects-based operations. And that's where we either make a very large change, or in some cases we will, I'm going to go back to the car example, we can actually go ahead and change the car so that it behaves the way we want it. Speeds up, slows down, slams on the brakes, drives into a wall. Or go into a physical plant and have those machines do things that they're not supposed to, and then you effectively create a bomb or an explosion in those factories. And so there's a lot of different types of kinetic operations that we can do with these. And when I say we, I'm talking the broad spectrum of all the actors, the nation state, the criminal, as well as the pseudo-OGAs. So there's a lot of different areas that we can go down into. And I know Jeremiah has a couple of very specific examples that are very relevant to the family offices. So I think at this point I'll pass it on, and then maybe later we can go back into some of the key takeaways on how to protect yourselves.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks for lifting the room. Thank you. And I've been told I have 5 minutes by Bob here, so I won't go long, I promise. But I've spent the last 15 years being hired to hack into corporations, family offices, hospitals, casinos, government organizations, ethically, of course, not illegally. And what I'd like to share today in this brief time that we have left is the problem is that the same attacks for those 15 years are the same attacks being used over and over and over to compromise, good, honest people, family offices, corporations. It doesn't really change. And some of the things that I'll share that would be relevant to the audience here today are things like wire fraud. It's one of the things that continues to happen almost weekly, getting phone calls of someone got into our account, someone stole, and for some reason the number seems to be around 500,000 US dollars, and we don't know how it happened. You reverse engineer the attack. It's not highly technological. It's usually what I would consider kind of traditional scam artists in a way, con artistry, where they've either gotten credentials for login for an email account, let's say for a CFO. There was not what's called multi-factor authentication or a third step to get into the email account. So all they needed was the username and password, which could have been from a data leak or on the dark web or whatever it may be. But they log in, they start operating as if they are the CFO for the particular company. And then they wait to see what kind of transactions are going on. So oftentimes they're extremely patient. They can wait up 3 months, 6 months or longer. And in one of the most recent phone calls that I received personally was a private aviation company was about to onboard a brand new client. They said our client ended up wiring $700,000 or so to someone out of the country, and it didn't come to us. And the way that they found out about it was the client said, "Hey, we wired you the money. Did you get it? We're ready to kind of onboard." And they said, "We didn't receive it. I don't think you actually sent it." And when they showed the confirmation screenshots, they then realized that that money was pretty much long gone and it was impossible to claw back. And again, it wasn't super complicated, but that is a very common attack that happens over and over. For corporations, for family offices, it's extremely common. And I think that one of the biggest issues that I've seen that continues to bother me today is when you bring up cybersecurity to someone in an organization and they say, "Oh, we're fine, we don't accept credit cards or we don't take payments," or whatever it may be. For some reason, there's almost this reverse paranoia that if you don't accept payments, you're fine, they're not going to come after you.
Which is great from an offensive perspective.
Absolutely, and I think that we're making it too easy for the attacker. And there are some basic protocols that and things that can be done that are not super technical, but would yield tremendous results for preventing wire fraud. Social media account takeovers are another huge thing where if you're a person of influence, what if someone got a hold of your Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn, and what kind of damage could they do by sending malicious messages that may have malware payloads or ransomware and things like that? And then you find out that that's being sent through your name to your valuable contact list. So just having access to one of your accounts is extremely valuable. And another thing is obviously ransomware. I'm sure we've all heard of ransomware, but it's extremely common because it's modern day bank robbery. I mean, it's really interesting that it's where the victim has to somehow cooperate, with the bad guys now in order to get your money back. Usually they demand payment and then they send you an encryption key or code basically to unlock your data. And if you don't do it, you're locked up, you can't operate, and so forth. So those are some of the basic things. And then kind of a selfish plug, we've been putting together a book called Confessions of a Hacker. Should be out within about a month. And it's just stories like those that are happening all the time, over and over, and what you can do to protect yourself from it. And would love to share that with anyone here that's interested. Just feel free to come up and say hi, and I'd be glad to send you a copy.
I'd also like to sort of add to that.
Absolutely.
You brought up a couple of really key points here. One is people are not talking to each other. And that is critically, for me, important because if I do an attack on one particular organization, I can now replicate that to others. If you guys start talking to each other, then one person was penetrated, but then the other organizations can close that down. So not talking is actually really good for the offensive side. And then if you take a look at some of the other things that he was referring to, a lot of these are basic things that can be done without a lot of work on your end. And I will guarantee that a majority of the people here have someone in their network.
Absolutely.
That's flat out. I'm convinced of that, based on the first type of operation, which is intelligence gathering. And so there's a lot of different ways of collecting intelligence on each of the different organizations, and people are pulling that back.
Yeah.
There's a lot of botnets out there that are coming in, and then automated attacks. That's a big shift that's actually happening now. So it's becoming less human. They'll get in and then use automated AI to push through the network.
That's not a service we provide. He's got no reason to tell you that, other than it's absolutely true, right? Like
If we could leave you just with one number, does anyone know the significance of 212 days?
212
days.
Yes.
It's the average time, according to a report done by IBM, to detect a breach, which is over 6 months' time. So can you imagine how much damage? And that's what's been reported. What about what's not being reported, right? So if it's over 6 months to even detect a breach, and these are the big ones that we see in the news, you can imagine what kind of damage a nefarious individual or group could do in that period of time. And again, it's just something that we have to improve and realize that the threat is real and it's not something that we can hide up from. Cybersecurity really needs to be part of the organization.
And that kind of ties into the last phase of the operational cycle, which is cleanup. After we go in, get what we need, we then clean up and wipe our footprints.
If there's no trace.
Happy note.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, we'll be here all week.
all right, this was intended to be a bit of a wake-up call. And there are some basic hygiene elements, and that's really at issue. What Jeremiah has agreed to do is make available in the Library of Truth, our Bibliothèque Fiducia, a very clear, like, here are the things that need to be done. And
Right.
it's all about passwords and cleansing and changing. Nothing of it is necessarily surprising. But the only thing that matters here is that you might do it now. Thank you. Guys, that was terrific.